What's valuable in the Homeric world? Honor, glory, power, the ability to get revenge, sexual gratification. That doesn't read like a litany of Christian values. Something happened in the West. Something happened. Judeo-Christian morality is not required by the nature of the universe. It's not required by God who doesn't exist. It's not objectively true. There is only one source of value, and it's you, right? It's you. There is no real moral fact, right? There is just an emotional, affective response.
In such a framework, how does moral improvement work?
Improvement is, shall we say, in the eye of the beholder.
Why does this matter? What is at stake?
If God is dead, anything goes. Why should we believe in the moral equality of all human beings?
But if you say Hitler is abhorrent and disgusting, and Hitler says, no, my values are awesome, then you can't say you're wrong, Hitler, right? You don't have that basis to say that. When you say something like abortion is right or wrong, you think you're stating an objective fact, right? Like dinosaurs roam the earth. But Nietzsche thinks you're just expressing a subjective taste, like I like vanilla over chocolate. This position is called moral anti-realism, that there's no objective right or wrong. In this interview, we're going to discuss Nietzsche's fascinating arguments for moral anti-realism, but the even more interesting insight is why Nietzsche wants to convince others of this position. Now, usually, anti-realism leads to a position of tolerance. If my views are subjective, then I should be much more accommodating to other positions because it's not like I'm right and they're wrong. Nietzsche argues for anti-realism so that higher men, creative geniuses, will be less accommodating, will give less weight to the dominant morals of a society. If all values are subjective, then I might as well create my own. And if reason is not the ultimate foundation of value, then I have license to use force, rhetorical or physical, to spread my ideas. Nietzsche's hope is that by convincing higher men about the subjectivity of values, it'll empower them to create and forcefully establish their own new value systems. Brian Leiter is one of the world's top Nietzsche scholars, and we begin this discussion by giving an overview of Nietzsche's moral views before discussing why Nietzsche thought no morality, including his own, is objective. Many people find the content of Nietzsche's morality quite disturbing, right? Some of the disturbing things, he's an anti-egalitarian, as you say, he's very illiberal. He cares primarily about production of higher men, creative geniuses, maybe Napoleon and Caesar as well. He thinks that slavery could be justified if it meant that a smaller class could gain leisure to produce greatness. He exalts severe selfishness. He dislikes moralities that are about altruism and compassion. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. What are your personal views on the content of Nietzsche's morality?
Okay, so I want to say something. I think there's a few nuances on the positions you described that are worth noting. He infamously says slavery, in some sense, is a condition of every high culture. And I think as a descriptive matter, at least at the time he was writing, that was actually true everywhere, right? That whether it was, the immiserated working classes in Europe, which Nietzsche actually wrote was recognized, had it pretty badly off, or the actual slave societies of ancient Greece, right? So that's kind of a descriptive, claim he's making. He certainly doesn't think it's an objection, however. Right. So that's certainly right. And the phrase severe selfishness, the phrase he actually uses, severe self-love, and the emphasis has to be on severe because he contrasts it with what he calls the selfishness of the sick, right? Donald Trump is the selfishness of the sick, right? It's just, me, but not for the sake of anything other than pathological narcissism. Whereas, Nietzsche, I think, has much more in mind people like Beethoven and Goethe, who are examples he himself gives. He does give Napoleon as an example, but not Caesar, actually, of a particularly notable higher human being. So if you think of it in the Beethoven case, it's, Beethoven was nominally a Christian and so on, but he did not live a Christian life. Everything in his life was organized around what he needed in order to keep composing. So so it was a kind of severe self-love, but it wasn't for indulgence. It was because he had this great creative project, right, of which we all know, that he was so committed to pursuing that everything else had to take a back seat to that. One of Nietzsche's objections to the morality of pity, of altruism, of egalitarianism is that he thinks it is incompatible with a certain kind of human flourishing, right? And again, Beethoven is the paradigm case, right? If Beethoven had actually taken Christian morality seriously, he didn't. He wouldn't be Beethoven. We wouldn't be talking about him, right? And I think there's an interesting kind of profound observation there about the psychology of, great creativity and the kind of extended discipline over a life that is required for that. The part of Nietzsche I think that is the most disturbing is the deep anti-egalitarianism. That is his rejection of the equality of human beings qua human beings. And I don't particularly share that. I think it would be fair to say. I'm not sure that many people share it. The ones who profess to share it usually aren't very attractive people. But I think it also presents a real challenge that philosophers and others have to think about, which is why should we believe in the moral equality of all human beings qua human beings? And it turns out philosophically to be very difficult to explain that, right? Nietzsche thought Christianity helped do that, right? Everyone is made in the image of God, right? We are all equal because we all have a soul that was given to us by God. Nietzsche doesn't believe that. God is dead. We don't have a soul in that sense. And so Nietzsche thinks without Christianity, belief in this kind of equality, moral equality, will fade away. The irony is Nietzsche seems to have been completely wrong about that. That is, God's been dead for a while now, and that kind of basic egalitarianism is still a very, very powerful commitment.
Right. So what you take away from Nietzsche, i.e. his observations on the type of religious devotion needed for creative genius, and what you don't take away from Nietzsche, right, his inegalitarian sentiments, helps, I think, answer my next question, which is what I found most interesting when preparing for this interview, because in addition to being a great Nietzsche scholar, the other thinker that you probably devote most of your time writing, thinking about is Marx. And so the question I was going to ask you was, how does one of the top Nietzsche scholars find his way to Marx, one traditionally considered on the left, one traditionally considered on the right?
Yeah. Now, what I think is interesting about the juxtaposition of Marx and Nietzsche is, they present the most profound challenge to each other, as it were. One way I like to put this is by saying, Marx has no psychology. He just doesn't think, systematically or carefully about the mind, about the unconscious, about the well springs of motivation, right? Everything for him is about structure, social structure, economic structure. And Nietzsche's the opposite. He thinks only about individual psychology and thinks not at all about social structure or economic structure. In this sense, there's something kind of complementary, right? Even though there's this profound moral difference between them over this issue of egalitarianism. But, someone who is sympathetic to Marx needs to think about Nietzsche's challenge. Because if Nietzsche's challenge is right, then, something like the Marxian ideal society in which, this is tricky because I don't think equality is an important moral ideal from Marx. Freedom is, right? The freedom of people to be able to work without regard for how they're going to survive, to work on the things they really want to work on. And, that ideal, I think, isn't entirely foreign to Nietzsche. But Nietzsche seemed to think that a society that had egalitarian features would be a society in which the greatest kinds of human flourishing would no longer exist. Right? In that sense, there's a profound tension between them. Marx thinks there's going to be lots of great creativity in the post-capitalist world, and Nietzsche thinks that kind of world is one because of its moral culture that's going to be incompatible with the next Beethovens or the next Goethes and so on. And to me, that's fascinating. I'm not sure what I think about it at the end of the day, but I've been trying for 30 years to understand it.
So when you talk about the synergies between the two thinkers, there's two things you highlight. One is the fact that they're complements. One focuses on the material structure and one focuses on the psychology. But there's another synergy, which is that they seem to agree on something. And now let me read you a quote from your book. Nietzsche attributes the sorry state of German culture in this period to the, I quote Nietzsche, crudest and most evil forces, the egoism of the moneymakers and the military despots. Notice, of course, that his objection to capitalism and militaristic nationalism is not moral in any conventional sense of that term, but almost aesthetic. They, the military and capitalism, pose obstacles to the flourishing of cultural greatness. What this quote helped draw out for me is that there's a whole tradition of actually right-wing critiques of capitalism from the aristocratic right. And Nietzsche is one of them, and he critiques it on the basis of cultural greatness. Another thing that comes to mind is Tocqueville. Tocqueville, when he came to America and he saw capitalism in America, I believe he said, America will never produce a Pascal, because we Americans are way too frenzied in our industry to have that sort of patience to engage that type of thinking. So that seems to be one thing that Nietzsche and Marx both agree on. They dislike capitalism, but for very different reasons.
Certainly for very different reasons, though I think, Marx himself was clearly quite aware of the way in which in a capitalist culture, norms of the marketplace come to dominate everything, including culture, right? So how do we know Van Gogh is a great painter? Well, because his painting was just auctioned for 80 million, right? I mean, that is a way of thinking that sort of seeps into a capitalist society. But certainly Marx's basic objection to capitalism is it makes most people badly off, and that is not, as it were, what Nietzsche is concerned about. I would hesitate a little to describe this as a criticism, at least in Nietzsche's case, from the aristocratic right. Because, you want to think the aristocratic right, you think Edmund Burke, who wants to preserve traditional religion and and the aristocracy and so on and so forth. But he's also not sympathetic to bourgeois society, to Christianity, right? To, the tradition, to the marketplace. So he's very hard to place this way, right? What puts him sort of on the right is the anti-egalitarianism. But even his anti-egalitarianism is of a rather strange kind. And of course, it has none of the sort of, racial components that were very common in the 19th and then, of course, in the 20th century.
So, of course, this is the last question I'm going to ask on Marx and Nietzsche. The big difference is the egalitarian versus the inegalitarian debate. You seem to side on, like most moderns, the egalitarian side, even though, as you confessed, Nietzsche does give really good arguments against egalitarianism being a value. Why do you make that sort of final siding with Marx instead of Nietzsche on this regard?
So I think Nietzsche raises an important challenge, which many contemporary philosophers take seriously, which is, what's the basis on which we should think all human beings deserve equal moral consideration? And it's a very tricky question to answer once you give up religion. Once you give up God made us equal as the answer. And people try to say, well, we all have something in common. But the thing is, everything we have in common, every sort of empirical attribute we have in common unevenly, right? Which makes it then, again, difficult to explain. Now, Nietzsche is fundamentally what in the philosophical tradition is called a sentimentalist. He thinks moral judgments reflect sort of emotional responses. And the emotional responses we have to actions or states of affairs or behavior, are typically inbred from a very young age, right? We get inculcated and learn to repeat the ones that we see from our parents, from our school, from our church, and so on, right? And so we get sort of, accustomed to egalitarian feelings, right? And the thing about egalitarian feelings is they can be very deeply embedded in us without any rational or empirical foundation at all, which is like every moral feeling in Nietzsche's view, right? So, the simple answer is I was brought up with egalitarian feelings. They're pretty hard to shake. And then as a purely pragmatic matter, it doesn't seem to me that the evidence of states that adopt anti-egalitarian policies is very encouraging. So I'd much rather have liberal states than Nietzschean states.
Let me reframe your answer. Tell me if I got it right. You're saying, yes, Nietzsche drew his sword and cut down really a lot of the basis of egalitarian morality. However, he also used that sword to cut down all morality, right? To show that there's very few rational bases for anything. And suddenly, the egalitarian position seems just as viable as the other ones.
That's close. I mean, it is the case that Nietzsche doesn't think any moral judgments have a rational or epistemically special foundation, right? That fundamental evaluative beliefs do not have any rational justification, right? A person's fundamental evaluative judgments, their feelings, just tells you something about the kind of person they are. You know, either their psychology, where they were brought up, right, and so on. So in that sense, moral egalitarianism is in the same boat as every other moral judgment. Moral judgments at bottom rest on these emotional responses that we're kind of just inculcated in. We're trained to have. And we have them even though they lack, right, rational or empirical foundations. They're pretty difficult to give up. And that's the great challenge Nietzsche faces in his work, because he's dealing with an audience that just takes for granted that something like Judeo-Christian morality, those are the only kind of moral feelings worth having. And so he's trying everything he can, as it were, to dislodge people from that complacency. Right.
Right. So I think that's a great transition point, because I've asked you about the content of Nietzsche's morality. And for the rest of this interview, I want to focus on something I think is even more interesting, unique in your treatment of Nietzsche, which is the form which that content comes in, specifically his anti-realism. And as a provisional pass for our audience, it's the belief that there's no objective value or truth judgments, and therefore no perspective ought to be necessarily privileged over others. Before we investigate this view, its arguments, objections, and implications, tell us why we should care about this debate. Why does it matter which side we land on? Realism, anti-realism, why does this matter? What is at stake?
Okay. I want to amend very slightly the way you put it. I don't think it is Nietzsche's view that there are not objective truths. Okay. I do think it is his view that there are no objective values. Okay. And to say there's no objective value is to say that there is no fact about whether something is really morally right or wrong that exists in the world independent of us, right? Value depends entirely on us, okay? If we had never discovered the evidence that the dinosaurs existed, it still would be an objective fact that dinosaurs roamed the earth. We happen to discover the evidence about it. It's not like that with value, right? That slavery is morally wrong, right, is not a fact about the world to be discovered. It is a judgment that people have made at different times in different places. At some places they haven't, and so on. So value judgments are very variable that way. Okay. Now, why does it matter? Well, maybe the example I've given has already suggested. Many people, of course, are tempted by the thought that if values are not objective, you know, here's Dostoevsky's version: if God is dead, anything goes. All right. More precisely, if God doesn't exist, nothing is forbidden, would be the way to put it. And Dostoevsky was having this thought that, in a way, Nietzsche is embracing, which is Dostoevsky thought of God as the sort of vindication for what moral judgments were correct, what ones were incorrect, what was really morally right, what was really morally wrong. And if there is no such fact, right, well, then there's a sense in which it's up to us. Right? And many people find that quite disturbing. Right? Many people would like to think that it is not simply a fact about evolving human attitudes that slavery is now regarded as wrong, whereas that would have seemed bizarre, you know, in antiquity, right? Where it seemed obviously, you know, right, wonderful, essential, and so on. People would like to think, no, right? Just like we discovered Newtonian mechanics, we also discovered that slavery is really wrong. And Nietzsche is denying this. Nietzsche is denying that fundamental values have any objective standing, right?
So another way to frame your answer is really everything is at stake, right? So much of our life's decisions. I mean, sometimes we think we're just making preferences of taste, like you like water, I like Coca-Cola. But you're saying even the things like, is slavery good or bad? Can we have premarital sex or not? Which we want to say that there's an objective truth there. That is what is being denied, and that is what is at stake. And that's what I want to spend this interview exploring with you. And I'm going to structure this interview into 3 parts. So the first part is we're going to precisely understand what is Nietzsche's position. The second part, we're going to talk about arguments and potential objections. And the third part, and the one that I'm most excited about, is prescriptions. If Nietzsche is right, how do we live in a world without objective values? So let's start with the first one. Let me read you from your book how you summarize this position. We're talking about norms. We're talking about the level of morality here. There do not exist any mind-independent or judgment-independent facts about value?
So the basic idea, right, is to say that value, whether something is valuable, is not mind-independent. Is to say that whether something has a value, good or bad value, right or wrong, good or evil, okay, depends on the human mind. It depends on how human beings respond to it, how they judge it, and so on, okay? Let's take an example that has nothing to do with morality, but I find it's often a useful example for clarifying what's at stake here. Let's take the idea of what's fashionable, okay? A Platonist about what's fashionable would say there are forms of the fashionable that are completely independent of anything human beings believe, right? So that you could look at an entire culture and say that is not a fashionable culture because it doesn't come close to instantiating the form of the fashionable. That's an absurd view. Nobody believes that, not even Platonists, right? On the other hand, what's fashionable isn't completely subjective in the following sense, right? Which is, you know, if I showed up at the interview today wearing a striped shirt and plaid pants and said, what do you think of my fashionable outfit? You would be correct in saying that is a little strange. It's not fashionable, right? That is, what's fashionable doesn't just depend on me. It isn't purely subjective, right? There's a kind of communal consensus about what's fashionable, right? So you are fashionably dressed. I think, I'm not a great judge of this. My wife makes sure I'm fashionably dressed to the extent possible. But now let's go to morality, right? Slavery is morally wrong. The most extreme view, which you find in antiquity in Protagoras, is the view that whether slavery is wrong depends on whether you judge it to be wrong. So slavery can be wrong for you and right for me, and that's all there is to it. Okay? That is an extreme form of anti-realism about value.
And Nietzsche does not hold that view.
I think he has a view pretty close to that. I think his view is actually probably closest to that about questions of moral value. I think he recognizes that in the case of moral value, many people share the same response, right? Because morality is a kind of cultural and social phenomenon, right? This goes back to what we were saying earlier. You know, the community inculcates certain moral feelings in people, and so lots of people have similar moral responses. But you could have a more moderate view than the extreme Pythagorean view, where you say morality is a little like the fashionable, relative to the community, right? It's relative to a particular community. So, you know, slavery is right for the Greeks, but wrong for us, okay? Now, again, that's not very satisfying for a lot of people. They want to say, no, the Greeks were wrong, and we have the correct moral belief about that. But again, Nietzsche's kind of position rules that out. Right? We have no position for saying that there is an objectively right answer to the question of the wrongness of slavery, because the wrongness of slavery is simply a matter of the emotional, affective response people have to slavery. Okay? There's one qualification I want to make about this. Often people's moral beliefs presuppose certain non-moral claims, certain non-moral truths. I take it that many people who think abortion is morally wrong believe that because they believe there is a soul that you are destroying, that God put into the fetus, and now you're destroying it. And that's what makes it wrong, right? Now, there in principle, you could have a debate, right? Is the belief in a soul, is the belief in God, is that rationally defensible, okay? So sometimes our moral beliefs presuppose what we might just call factual beliefs that might be better or worse justified. But what Nietzsche thinks is that there are some evaluative beliefs that are bedrock. They're just like our basic evaluative beliefs.
Equality?
And the moral equality of human beings, yes, is a perfect example of that. And there, I take it, he thinks there is no objective fact of the matter, right? And that means, among other things, right, that Nietzsche's judgment that people are not morally equal, right? Or let's take a slightly different example, go back to where we started on your comment about slavery, right? If some of the population has to be enslaved in some sense so that we can have Beethoven, Nietzsche says yay, right? That's fine. Beethoven is worth it, right? Somebody else could look at that and say, no, 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 right? Beethoven is wonderful, but it's not worth the harm to so many people who have to be enslaved. And that could be a kind of bedrock evaluative judgment. And there Nietzsche thinks there isn't an objectively right answer. So that if someone disagrees with Nietzsche at that level, Nietzsche doesn't have an argument to persuade them why they're wrong. Okay?
Right.
That is an implication of anti-realism about values, that when you get the conflicting basic evaluative judgments, we really just have the conflict of brute attitudes. And there it is something like, as you put it earlier, brute preferences. I don't like the word preference because I don't think preference, I prefer chocolate to vanilla, but I'm not sure that does justice to my attitude about moral equality versus inequality, right? It's a little stronger than a preference. But that's just a terminological quibble.
Right. So I just want to be perfectly clear here. When it comes to aesthetics, how good we're dressed or not dressed, Nietzsche thinks it is purely up to us, or that he thinks it's relative to a community. So
Nietzsche doesn't even think about this case, but I think he would have to agree that the notion of being fashionable is relative to a community. It's not purely subjective, whereas the most basic evaluative judgments, is it worth it to sacrifice a huge number of people for Beethoven to be possible? Right? Nietzsche's on the Beethoven side. Most people, modern people, are on the, wait a second, what about the majority side? That is a brute evaluative judgment. More people share the egalitarian instinct, and fewer would share Nietzsche's. And is the difference between those two, how well or not we're dressed right now, or whether it's okay to sacrifice the majority for Beethoven, is it because one is much more foundational than the other, or is it because they're different realms? One is the aesthetic realm and one is the moral realm. Why is one relative to the group and one just subjective? Okay. I think it does have to do with different realms, right? And I only introduced the example of the fashionable because I think it's a useful case where people can kind of agree that fashion isn't purely subjective. The idea of the fashionable references a communal standard. Now, some philosophers have that view about morality too. That was true in antiquity. I mean, there were other sophist thinkers who favored sort of communal relativism. But Protagoras' famous doctrine, man is the measure of all things, seems to imply a purely subjective version of that. The moral case is complicated precisely because people often share moral attitudes, right? And this goes back to something I was saying before. Nietzsche's challenge is that most of his readership has been inculcated into Judeo-Christian moral feelings. And he's trying to dislodge them from that. He's trying to make them feel a little differently. He's trying to make them, as it were, feel the way, to share some of those moral feelings of, say, the Homeric world, right? And maybe this is a nice example to introduce here, right? Because, if you think, because everyone, has read the Homeric epics, right? And Nietzsche, of course, was a scholar of classical antiquity. So this is very, very vivid to him. Maybe it's worth mentioning, right? Nietzsche's father was a Lutheran pastor. His mother's father was a Lutheran pastor. His father's father was a Lutheran pastor. He went to university to study theology initially. And he is, as I like to say, the most spectacular dropout from Christian theology in history. But he knew Christianity from the inside. But at the same time, he knew antiquity. And you look at the Homeric epics, and you can see none of the values of Christianity are there, right? What's valuable in the Homeric world? Honor, glory, power, the ability to get revenge, sexual gratification. That doesn't read like a litany of Christian values. So Nietzsche is very aware of this, right? That something happened in the West, that we go from the Homeric world, or even, the Roman world, to our world where the values are equality, humility, poverty, chastity, self-restraint, right? Something happened. Right. Feelings have changed, and then he wants to understand why. I want to push you a bit more on something you said about morality. While it being a preference, you don't want to say it's like, I like vanilla and you like chocolate ice cream. This is a quote from your book. Different types have different tastes,
And as Zarathustra says, all of life is a dispute about tastes. If we do agree that these fundamental axioms of morality are ultimately subjective in some strong sense, then all we can say is that someone like Hitler, he had bad taste. But that, we can't say anything more, right, in this worldview?
We can say a number of other things. I mean, again, you know, Hitler is an example. He didn't just have bad taste. He had lots of false beliefs.
Right.
Right. I mean, he had lots of false empirical beliefs based on pseudo-race science, based on, you know, what he thought the Jews were doing. I mean, so there were a lot of false beliefs. What I was resisting was the word preference. I mean, the problem with Hitler's taste, right? Hitler's, you know, profoundly anti-egalitarian taste, right? Isn't that I don't prefer it. It's that I find it disgusting, that I find it appalling, that it tells you something about Hitler as a human being, that he has the kind of fundamental values that he has, right? And I'm not sure we get much help by also saying, and he was objectively wrong, right? It's enough to know that, you know, he's abhorrent and disgusting, and he ought to be killed, right, if you don't share those tastes.
But if you say Hitler's is abhorrent and disgusting, and Hitler says, no, my values are awesome, then you can't say you're wrong, Hitler, right? You don't have that basis to say that.
If our disagreement gets down to the bedrock, that is correct. If it gets down to the bedrock, as I say, the complication with Hitler, he's got lots of actually objectively false beliefs that are underlying this. But if we get to bedrock, right, and Hitler just says, I have a taste for Aryans and no one else, right?
There's nothing you can say to him.
That is correct. There it is like the sense of taste we get in the, you know, in the gustatory realm, right?
Right. Last question here. So in such a framework, how does moral improvement work?
Well, the first thing to say is moral improvement is, shall we say, in the eye of the beholder. Does Nietzsche think that 19th century Europe is morally improved, over the first century AD Roman Empire? I don't think so. To talk about moral improvement is already to presuppose some evaluative standard. What's a moral improvement for the Christian may be a moral regression for someone like Nietzsche.
Right. Although I can already think from our conversation alone that there's a few ways of moral improvement that perhaps transcends these basic evaluative judgments. One way, it sounds like, is the way you build your basic evaluative judgments into actual moral positions. A lot of them require truths, require beliefs. And if you correct a false belief, maybe that's a way of a standard independent way to morally improve. Here's another example. America freeing the slaves, right? America freeing the slaves on its own standard of equality did better. So surely that's another way of moral improvement, which is that I'm actually meeting my own standards.
Good.
And maybe there's even a third way here, and tell me.
Can I? Yeah. I would like to say something about the first two.
Please.
Because I think they're important ones and they're slightly different, right? So your second one is you could assess moral improvement, as it were, internally by reference to the morality you accept, okay? And that's certainly possible, but that doesn't answer the question whether this is really moral improvement. Again, it's moral.
That is a judgment.
It's a moral improvement by your lights, by the lights of our community, right? So that's certainly a possibility. The first example you gave is a slightly different one, and it has a complicated relationship to Nietzsche's thought, which is sometimes people's moral judgments are based on false factual beliefs, okay? So Hitler makes certain moral judgments based on false beliefs about the differences between Jews and Aryans, or basically Aryans and every other non-Aryan race. Okay, and therefore, wouldn't it be a moral improvement if your moral beliefs didn't presuppose false factual beliefs? Okay, and I agree that seems like an attractive idea. It's a difficult idea for Nietzsche to embrace for the following reason, which is that one of the important themes Nietzsche returns to again and again is that, as he puts it in Beyond Good and Evil, the falsity of a belief is not necessarily an objection to it. That is, it is a condition of life that we have lots of false beliefs and lots of illusions. And so Nietzsche rejects the very common thought that an epistemic defect, we presuppose something false necessarily means we ought to give up the belief that involves that false presupposition. So he can't quite endorse that because of this unusual view he has about epistemic presuppositions.
So that's very helpful. And I just want to push you one last way of moral improvement. Let's say we had a student here, and his core baseline value before was, I'm going to say something completely ridiculous, throwing feces at his parents. That's what he loved to do. And then
he's a chimpanzee.
He's a chimpanzee, exactly. Now he comes back and he likes reading Nietzsche. He likes reading your books on Nietzsche and contemplation. Isn't there something we can say about the human nature itself and how the contemplative life is more rewarding than throwing feces? Is there nothing, is this a rejection of human nature at all? That there's no common form of moral life such that there are some values that are just going to be much more palatable, at least for most people?
Okay. Good. It's an amusing example. I mean, my first inclination about your example is to say it's not so much a moral improvement as an aesthetic one. I mean, this is a much more attractive and appealing human life.
Well, he's throwing feces at his parents. That's what makes it moral.
I agree it has some bearing on the moral quality of the life. So you have the idea from the Aristotelian tradition that there are certain characteristic features of being human that, as it were, once you understand those, you understand what it is to lead a good human life. Okay? Nietzsche does not hold this view. Among other things, he thinks that the characteristic features of being human they're less genteel than Aristotle thinks they are. I mean, Aristotle, of course, thinks the distinctive human capacity is rationality. Nietzsche denies this. Nietzsche does think that people, have a capacity for reason, but he doesn't think there's a faculty of practical reason. He doesn't think that reason plays a very large role in a human life. He thinks that human beings are fundamentally made up of drives of various kinds that they're largely unaware of, and many of these drives aren't very nice. They are drives towards cruelty, drives for sexual gratification, drives for power, and so on, right? This is what's distinctive of us, right? And there are many different ways, of course, in which these drives can manifest themselves, right? All that being said, Nietzsche does make judgments about the value of different lives. But if I'm right about his anti-realism, to go back to where we started on this, he doesn't think that those judgments are objectively true.
All right, so that's the first part of the interview, just really understanding Nietzsche's, as you call it, moral anti-realism. Now let's talk about the arguments and objections against this position. Here's an argument that you point out. Moral facts are superfluous. Why is that?
Okay. So one of the arguments against moral realism, the idea that there are mind-independent moral facts, is based on a certain epistemic norm, namely that things that are real are part of the best explanation of what we can observe. Right? And you might view this epistemic norm as one of the legacies of the scientific revolution. If you want to know whether something is a real feature of the world, the question is it part of the best explanation of things we can actually observe? So we do experiments, for example. And the worry about morality is that moral facts do not appear to be part of the best explanation of our moral judgments. Let us go to the flaming pussycat case that comes from the late philosopher Gilbert Harman. Harman, who's a moral anti-realist, says, if you see a bunch of, teenage hoodlums setting a cat on fire, you will judge that's wicked, that's morally wrong. And he says the best explanation of that judgment does not need to assume it's really morally wrong, objectively morally wrong. It just needs to assume certain things about the sociology and psychology of the upbringing, of your upbringing, right? Which is roughly what Nietzsche would say, right? You judge it to be morally wrong because you have a certain kind of emotional response to that you've been inculcated to have since you were very young, and so on. That suffices for explaining the moral judgment. You don't have to assume there's really anything there. The analog that might maybe help make vivid what Nietzsche thinks about this is the man dying of thirst in the desert who hallucinates, right, sees an oasis in the distance, right? There is no oasis. The explanation for why he sees an oasis is because he has this burning desire to have something to drink, so he sort of has the illusion that there is an oasis, but there is no real oasis. Same thing with moral judgments. There is no real moral fact, right? There is just an emotional, affective response to some state of affairs.
The example you give in the book is injustice in apartheid Africa. And you're saying the claim that it is objectively unjust is superfluous because it's enough to point to the economic conditions of exploitation and all these real things. And I think that the bigger problem is, I think, a very simple question. Where is this injustice, right? Bring this injustice and show it to me. That's kind of the objection here. Is that right?
The South Africa case adds a little wrinkle to our flaming pussycat case. Some philosophers who are moral realists have said, look, why did apartheid collapse in South Africa? Answer, because it was unjust. Okay? So that's supposed to show injustice is part of the explanation for a major social transformation. Right? The response of the anti-realist is to say, first we can ask, well, what does it mean to say it's unjust? But the important response of the anti-realist is to say, it's enough if people believe it's unjust to explain why it collapses. It doesn't actually have to be unjust, right? That is, if people believe, go back to the guy hallucinating the mirage of the oasis, right? That he believes there is an oasis explains why he moves in that direction. There doesn't have to be an oasis. That people believe certain social or economic states of affairs are unjust is probably enough to explain why they do certain things, like revolt, right? Like resist, and so on. It doesn't actually have to be unjust. So yes, it is in the mind's eye.
Here is a potential pushback, and I'm curious to hear what your response would be. Maybe these higher level moral facts, like injustice, that's hallucinated, constructed, but might there not be a case where there's lower level building blocks, so to speak, of moral fact out there? For example, the utilitarian case would be pain and pleasure. And from that, we build on and create much more concepts which themselves are constructed, but they're grounded on real moral facts. Is that a possibility?
Well, it is a possibility. It is not one Nietzsche accepts, right? I mean, Nietzsche immediately would dispute that, pleasure is necessarily good and pain is necessarily bad, right? In one of Nietzsche's famous jokes, he says, man does not seek happiness, only the Englishman does. What Nietzsche would observe, which I think is this is a problem for the kind of utilitarian position you're imagining, is that people seem to do things all the time that are guaranteed to be painful, right? Which raises a question whether they really think pain is bad and pleasure is the only thing that is good. But Nietzsche would deny, as it were, the claim that pleasure is good. He wouldn't deny that people are often motivated to do what's pleasurable, right? He does deny what some utilitarians claim, that psychological hedonism is true. That is, people are always motivated to get pleasure, always motivated to avoid pain. Nietzsche, again, is too much of a study of, a student of history and especially antiquity. He could see immediately this is false.
So obviously, the next question is, if when we're responding to morality, when we're stating moral facts, we're not actually corresponding to something objective, that's Nietzsche's claim here, what is going on there? And here, I think, is your answer of what Nietzsche thinks is going on. I quote to you. Nietzsche, I argue, should be located within the familiar tradition of moral anti-realists who are also sentimentalists, like Hume. Philosophers who think the best explanation of our moral judgments is in terms of our emotional or affective responses to state of affairs in the world, responses that are themselves explicable in terms of psychological facts about the judger. Tell us how that mechanism works. How do we get from affects and interests to deriving moral judgments?
There's a kind of basic emotional or affective response we have that is the basis for a lot of our evaluative judgments. And this is sort of the affect of inclination and aversion, right? Feeling inclined towards something, that's a kind of positive valuation, or feeling, averted. You want to get away from something, right? That's kind of negative valence, right? And Nietzsche thinks that these are the kinds of things that evaluative responses, evaluative emotional responses, that are inculcated from a very young age, right? Don't pick up and play with your feces, right? Kids need to learn that. To don't hit your brother. They gradually start to gather the sense that how they are supposed to feel about those kinds of things. And then Nietzsche thinks, again, with the imposition of a culture, right? A culture, brings to bear a whole set of moral feelings, right? These feelings of inclination and aversion can start to get very, very complicated. Imagine someone who just instinctively, right, feels a sense of aversion when there's a dangerous enemy around, right? They want to pull away, okay? And in a Christian culture, right, they might feel that this is they might have, as it were,
it's a virtue.
A feeling about this feeling of theirs. Namely, it's a virtue, right? It's a virtue. Turn the other cheek. The same individual in a Homeric culture is going to feel shame, right? Because to want to pull away from dangerous enemies is pathetic, right? No, if dangerous enemies offend you, you go get them, right? You confront them, okay? So here we have layers of feeling. We have the basic feeling of pulling back from a dangerous enemy. Then there's a question, how do you feel about that feeling? And here, of course, cultures play a very substantial role. It's one of the reasons that there's so much variety in moral feelings across time and across different cultures, because people are taught, right, how they're supposed to feel about these basic feelings of inclination and aversion. Roughly, that's Nietzsche's picture.
I think this also makes Nietzsche's view a bit more plausible, because it seems like then there becomes a role for reason to play, right? Because while reason can't adjust these basic level feelings, or it's very hard for them to do so, maybe they can adjust these top level culturally induced meta feelings, right? So if I am a Christian and I read a lot of Nietzsche, maybe I can start developing through reason a Homeric attitude towards timidity. Is that right?
I'm not sure I would limit it just to the meta feelings, right? The feelings about feelings. I think even your basic affects can admit of a certain kind of criticism. Think of the first essay of Nietzsche's genealogy, right? I mean, when Nietzsche's describing the characteristic valuations of a slave morality, right? People who harm others, they're evil. People like us slaves who harm no one and are modest and so on, this is a virtue. Okay? And what is Nietzsche trying to do in the first essay? He is trying to elicit in his readers different feelings about this morality. He wants to make slave morality seem contemptuous. He wants to make it seem hypocritical, right? So he is trying to change the feelings of his readers, and he's doing it through his written presentation. But of course, he's not doing it the way philosophers usually do, through a rational argument, right? And this is why Nietzsche writes the way he does, because if it's feelings at the bottom, you can only change the feelings by affecting people's feelings, all right? And hence he uses ridicule. Hence he makes fun of people, contempt. He's very polemical, he's insulting, there are jokes and so on, right? This is how you affect people at a non-rational level so that they might feel differently about moral matters.
Why do you write in such an analytical way then?
Well, because if you want to read Nietzsche, go read Nietzsche. If you want to understand Nietzsche, I'm going to help you understand him. Poetry is one thing, scholarship about poetry is another. Scholarship about poetry that's written as poetry doesn't help you, all right? My goal is to help readers understand the big picture structure and a lot of the details, all right? But you won't change your feelings reading my book. But hopefully you'll understand Nietzsche better the next time you read him.
Fascinating. So let me try to summarize the picture of morality through affects. The word you use in your book is that morality is a symptom of affects. So I'm going to use the word one-to-one here. So it's directly a result of affects. When you're a Marxist and you see someone who's rich, you're infuriated. That's purely on a feeling level. However, that feeling is grounded on different reasons. It's grounded on different reasons and the type of sociality and culture you are in. So this doesn't mean that you can't use reason or people can't change their positions on things. But it does mean, even when you change these positions, at the ground, it's still nothing but feeling. It's not reason that has got at some kind of first principle. The bedrock of morality is feelings. And then reason can build structures on top that lead to different feelings that lead to moral statements. Is that right?
I think that's basically right. I'm going to just give you a very simple example, but I think it is in sympathy with your more general abstract characterization of it. If I'm very thirsty and I reach for the glass of water, and then you tell me that's not water, it's gasoline, right? That changes my desires, right? That's kind of an exercise of reason, right? And that's certainly, Nietzsche thinks, something that can be done, right? Why in the first essay, The Genealogy, does he try to argue that slave morality requires belief in free will, but there is no free will, right? Well, this goes back to one of the examples you gave earlier. It's where you're taking a presupposition of a moral judgment, the belief that people are free and morally blameworthy for their choices, and you're saying the belief in free will isn't justified. That might affect your feelings, your moral feelings about someone's potentially blameworthy actions.
Right. So I think where we push this argument is, now you've rendered the argument totally coherent for me, but I still want to reason to prefer it over the standard rational account, right? And the standard rational account is that through reason or through introspection, we get to some kind of bedrock of value, and then we construct a rational enterprise from it. I think this argument that I'm going to present to you next, this is your argument, is going to try to attack that position. And it's the argument from disagreement. So I quote you your book. The single most important and embarrassing fact about the history of moral theorizing by philosophers over the last 2 millennia, namely that after 2,000 years, moral philosophers cannot agree on what we really ought to do. This persistent disagreement on foundational questions, of course, distinguishes moral theory from inquiry in the sciences and mathematics, not perhaps in kind, but certainly in degree. In the hard sciences and mathematics, intellectual discourse regularly transcends cultural and geographic boundaries, and consensus emerges about at least some central propositions. It's through this amount of disagreement that you conclude. The easiest conclusion is there's nothing really there. Is that right?
Yep. That was a nice, clean statement. There's nothing there, right? I mean, if disagreement among well-informed, highly intelligent people persists for millennia, that makes it a little suspicious that there's really something there, right? I mean, how could it be that they couldn't, as it were, all agree, okay? And many contemporary philosophers, most famously Derek Parfit in his final work, he thinks in order for there to be an objective morality, all moral philosophies have to agree on it. And then he tries to show that they all really do. Nobody thinks he succeeded, but he accepts this thought. Now, Nietzsche just looks at it in the other way. But the history of Western, moral philosophy is just the history of foundational and intractable disagreement. It's a little bit embarrassing, or so you might think.
So I deeply relate to this, but when it comes to religious proof. And I think the form of argument that Nietzsche is highlighting here in philosophy, I believe it's a form of skepticism called equivalence. It's, you have a theory, and I'm going to make you skeptical of it by showing you an opposing theory that concludes something radically different that's just as grounded on solid foundations. And so, I'm not going to go into the reason why. I desperately want to be religious. I think as a Marxist, you're going to do a number on that. But I have such a hard time, not because I think one religion is incoherent, but they all seem fairly coherent if you read the greatest theologians of each tradition. So let me give you an example. One common strategy that these religions use to show that they're superior is to point to their worldly success, right? The Christians point to the super unlikely conversion of Constantine. The Jews point to their disproportionate influence with such a small amount of people, and they show, look, we're the chosen people. The Buddhists point to the conversion of King Ashoka, which is just as unlikely as Constantine. And of course, the Muslims point to Muhammad's worldly success. And by themselves, each of these arguments are quite convincing. You're like, something has to account for this supernatural outcome. But when you look at them against each other, suddenly you realize, well, isn't this just survivorship bias? So it's kind of like that. Is that right?
There is a similarity. Let me say, I don't think those arguments are at all convincing. I think they're kind of absurd. There's all kinds of explanations that wouldn't require assuming that the religions must be true. And the idea that worldly success is a proof of truth is very, very strange. So let's put that to one side. I think the more important issue that you're framing raises is whether this is a matter of equipollence. And the thing is, classical skeptical equipollence arguments have as their aim to get you to suspend belief. And that's not what Nietzsche's doing. Nietzsche's argument, the way I'm reconstructing it, is leading you to believe something, namely that there is no objective fact about fundamental values.
Right.
So in that way, it's a little different than an equipollence style argument, though it has a certain similarity to it. It really is, in my way of framing it, a kind of inference to the best explanation. What is the best explanation of why they don't all agree? Right? So to take your religion case, what's the best explanation for why the world's major religions don't agree on so many things? It's because there is no there, right? That the doctrines of these religions are doing other kind of work, including a lot of moral work, right? Evaluative work, right? Is really what's going on.
So one pushback to this argument from disagreement, is to say, look, we have made progress. As you say, no one believes in this sort of naive Platonism anymore. Not even Plato, right? In his later dialogues, he rejects the forms. And so, look, people are just wrong about a lot of things, and a lot of people are wrong about morality, but that doesn't mean there isn't a right morality. What do you say to that?
So notice your Plato example isn't an example of convergence about a question of value. It's a convergence on a metaphysical thesis. Now, but unfortunately, I got bad news for you. There's lots of philosophers who are still Platonists about certain domains. Even value, there are some. But you've studied philosophy, so you know that there is some philosopher that occupies every possible position in logical space. Has there been progress in terms of convergence and agreement in the sciences? Yes. This is one of the striking differences with moral philosophy. But in moral philosophy, right, when you get to the bedrock, you've got your utilitarians who think, consequences and happiness, these are the bedrock values. And the Kantians who say no, they think it's either a matter of motivations or dignity, or, you have different formulae, and they just have a fundamental disagreement. And, they've spent a long time trying to convince each other without any success. And then what you find is, and you see this even in contemporary philosophy, is that the dogmatic Kantians just think the utilitarians are reprobates and reprehensible, and the utilitarians think the Kantians are just insane, right? That's not a rational argument, right? That's just abuse.
It's the disagreement on the fundamental
At
things.
The fundamental level,
that's the issue, right?
When you get fundamental disagreement, you get abuse.
Right.
And we see that even in staid moral philosophers.
So I want to transition now to the third part of our discussion. To the first part, we talked about what is his views on moral anti-realism. The second part, we gave these three arguments, right? One is that moral facts are superfluous. One is the art of how actually morality works, and it's from argument and affect. And the third one, argument from disagreement, is to show that the most likely outcome is that there are no moral fundaments, first principles. This is the most important part of the interview. Why does Nietzsche want to communicate this to us? How do we live our lives if we're convinced by what Nietzsche has to say?
So, Nietzsche is pretty clear that he wants to undertake a critique of morality. Okay. And this is very challenging because people just take for granted that Judeo-Christian morality, this is his immediate audience, that's just what morality is. So what are you talking about, right? And one strategy of the critique is, his readers think this morality came to us from God. This morality is objectively true. And so Nietzsche wants to disabuse his readers of this. And he wants at least some of his readers, as his career goes on, he sort of gives up thinking he's going to reach just everyone with this. He wants at least his rightful readers to realize that all values, right, depend on human beings, right? And that Judeo-Christian morality is not required by the nature of the universe. It's not required by God who doesn't exist. It's not objectively true, right? That there is only one source of value, and it's you, right? It's you, okay? And now at least his rightful readers may choose to, as he says, create values. That is, to value differently than they have been taught all along. Once they realize this is not, as it were, an objective requirement that's being imposed upon them.
Right. So to summarize what you were saying, he wants to liberate us from a specific conception of morality and that it's objective, and he wants to liberate and produce the Beethovens and the great artists, the creative geniuses, and enable them to create their own values. So let me ask you this next question, because like you mentioned, Nietzsche doesn't think we should let go of an idea just because it's false, right? He holds I think the right position, the very interesting position, that a truth needs to be examined on its impact on life. So if there are certain falsehoods that are good to hold for a certain type of life, then we can actually hold them. Why isn't the objectivity of value one of these truths when paired with the right values? So let me give you an example here. If I am trying to create a new set of morality, surely it would aid me if I thought I had hit some kind of new objective bedrock. In fact, most of the religious creators who did create new religious systems did think so. So if his goal is to create these higher men who create new value systems, why isn't objective value a noble lie?
Okay. So I think you're quite right that believing in the objectivity of morality could be a useful illusion. Right? It's certainly very useful for the Pope, and it's very useful for the leader of every major religious tradition. Right? I think the reason Nietzsche does not go in that direction is because he thinks people are fundamentally different types of creatures. He thinks most people are herd animals, as he puts it. Right? That's not very polite, but that's Nietzsche for you. And he sometimes says herd morality for the herd. So maybe there's a morality that's right for the person of limited capabilities, limited aspirations, and so on. But with respect to potential higher human beings, right, there isn't, as it were, one morality, one set of values that is necessarily suitable for all of them. Right? So I take it he thinks, at least for his, again, rightful readers, this is a very personal, right, matter. And that, while it's important to disabuse a nascent Beethoven of the idea that they ought to take Christian morality seriously and live accordingly, because if they did, they wouldn't become Beethoven. What values the nascent Beethoven or the nascent Napoleon or the nascent Goethe, pick his three favorite examples, ought to hold, that's, as it were, there's nothing, one morality for all is something he's always opposed to, right? So in that sense, right, it isn't going to be viable. But the other thing is worth saying is while Nietzsche recognizes that illusions are a condition of life, right, he does think that, the higher human beings, his rightful readers, they have more tolerance for the truth than ordinary people. Right? So there is some difference between how much truth different kinds of people can handle. And I take it he probably thinks that his rightful readers are going to understand that God is dead, that morality isn't objective, and they're not going to fall for the idea that, some other set of values are really the objective values. They need to now embrace the idea that human beings are the source of all value. And this was one of the ideas the existentialists did pick up on in the 20th century.
Right. So what I'm hearing from your answer is you're responding, yes, Jonathan, we don't have to reject something just because it's false. We reject things on whether they're harmful or hurtful to life. The specific type of life that Nietzsche is interested in is the higher men. But you're saying, even the higher men are so different that no one objective morality is going to work for all of them. So if you promulgate a new morality, thinking that it's objective, maybe it's going to help it spread a bit faster, but you're going to actually be hurting even more of these higher men because they're all so different. And I think this is the point. This is maybe my greatest point of disagreement. You've convinced me a lot of things through this interview. But still my greatest point of disagreement is on the fundamental difference of people. And this popped up before when we talked about the feces throwing versus the philosophy example. He's rejecting the idea that essentially there is a human nature, right? That there's a human nature that shares structural elements. He must reject this.
Well,
is that
no,
right?
no, I don't think that's right. I think he's a big believer in human nature. What he rejects is the idea that the human nature is such that you can run the Aristotelian argument and say, well, human beings are essentially X, therefore a good human life involves the perfection of X. For Aristotle, X would be rationality. But he definitely believes in human nature. He thinks human beings are instinctively cruel, that they take pleasure in cruelty, that they have a drive for power, that they have a drive for sexuality. He thinks there are a lot of drives that are shared among all human beings. They come in different strengths. Different individuals have different hierarchies of their drives, right? And so they're capable of doing different things. But in that sense, he accepts human nature. But he doesn't, as far as I can see, accept the further sort of Aristotelian move, which is we can say this is what's essential, and therefore the perfection of that is what makes for a good human life.
Right, that's a very helpful clarification. So let's use the genealogy example of the master and the slave. There is a human nature in that they both want to express their power, right? That's the constant. Otherwise, Nietzsche wouldn't be able to do his psychological theories. What you are saying, however, is that their social, historical, their dispositions, their affects, their position in society is so different that what it means for one of them to express their will to power is exactly the thing that hurts the other person. So on one hand, there's a deep similarity. There's a deep human nature that pulses between the two. But what he's trying to show us is that there's also radical difference amongst people. Is that a good summary?
I think that's roughly right. The one thing I would say about master and slave is he does think, it's not just a social difference, he does think some people have masterly or noble psychologies and slavish psychologies. Even though the original distinction is in terms of social class, he thinks, fast forward to the present. He thinks there are plenty of people in the ruling class, today in America, say, who have slavish psychologies. That is, they're reactive in the way the slaves are, right? And they embrace slavish morality and so on. So that's the only emendation I would make to that. But I think the basic idea is right. Even if you think everybody has a drive towards power, what it means to realize power will depend on the type of person you are. And that's central to the third essay, The Genealogy, where he says the highest form of power for most people is merely self-preservation. They're so badly off that if they can remain attached to life, that's about as good as they can do in terms of the drive for power.
And what it means for them to express their power means affirming and rejecting values that could be completely different from each other, right? And hence, this whole sort of anti-realism. Now, there seems to be two directions that we can take this observation of moral anti-realism, and they seem directly opposed. One direction is tolerance, right? I have my values, and I understand that they're a preference, and you have your values. It's a very liberal position. However, there seems to be a case for intolerance here, and let me read you your book, where people share attitudes, reasoning about what one ought to do and what one ought to believe is possible. Where people do not share attitudes, reasoning is not possible and only force prevails in a dispute, whether that is the rhetorical force of producing a change in attitudes by whatever means are effective, or the physical or lawful force of suppressing contrary attitudes. Which way do we take anti-realism? Is it the way of tolerance or is it the way of force?
So notice that itself is just another value judgment, right? So I give you my answer. I mean, I think, again, as a matter of state policy, tolerance is always better. But there are limits to that, right? Now go back to Mr. Hitler, right? If, in fact, our difference with Hitler is one of brute evaluative attitude, I'm in favor of jail. For Hitler, that is, okay? So the answer is very complex, right? And it kind of depends who we're talking about, what we're talking about, and so on.
This is the last thing I want to bring up about prescriptions, about how we should live in a morally anti-real world. And I think it's fascinating because Nietzsche is going to rescue objectivity. He's going to revise it, but he's going to rescue it. And his ideal model for objectivity is Thucydides. So tell us about Thucydides and why Thucydides represented a form of moral objectivity.
Yeah, so it's... I'm not sure I would say Thucydides represents moral objectivity. But I think what Nietzsche finds very interesting about Thucydides is, as he puts it, that he's someone who can suspend his pros and cons, right? His positive and negative evaluative judgments in order to understand the phenomena, right? So why is Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War such a great and significant work? Well, one of the things he does is he's able to show us how the Athenians are really thinking about what they're doing, all right? the classic example is the Athenian dialogue with the Melians on the conquered island of Melos, right? And the Melians start talking about justice and so on, and the Athenians, in Thucydides' telling, say, don't start with this justice crap, right? Justice is between equals, right? We have power, you don't, and you will either submit on our terms or we'll kill you. Okay? Now, I don't think Thucydides approves of what the Athenians, their attitude. Indeed, I think the message of the history of the Peloponnesian War is that when a society becomes all consumed with a lust for power and glory, it self-destructs, which is what happens to Athens. But he never says that, Thucydides. He rather, right, he shows us, he suspends his moral judgment in order to show us realistically what really motivates the Athenians, right? And I don't think Thucydides thinks the Athenian ambassadors really said what he has them saying, but that's what they're really thinking. And that's their attitude everywhere, the Athenians.
Right. That's one way in which we can say, even you might not want to use this word, he's becoming more objective. But there's another way, which is that Thucydides shows us all the opposing arguments. And why I found that so interesting is because objectivity in this world, one might call a perspectival world, comes from excessive partiality. Is that right? Like, but by understanding all the moral views on a subject, I can gain a form of, it's fine if you don't want to use objectivity, but a form of greater knowledge. Is that right?
I think your basic idea is correct, that in Thucydides, you get a lot of competing perspectives on things. And then, just extracting from Thucydides, and if we go back to the original metaphor that Nietzsche gives us for perspectivism, which is seeing, right? And it is true that if you see something from more perspectives, you know more about it, right? So I see the chair sitting right in front of it, but then I could get up very close and I could look on the side and we could examine the bottom, right? All these perspectives would increase our objective knowledge of what the chair is like. And I think Nietzsche does think something similar is true about history, about the social world, and so on, though to take it back to Thucydides, I think it's particularly important that we can do what Thucydides does, which is suspend our own moral judgments about things. And of course, Nietzsche's complaint is that Plato doesn't do that. Plato, right, defames everyone he dislikes morally. Thucydides is willing to say, I'm going to help you see how the Athenians really think and how the Melians really think.
And that is what I found so fascinating as a conclusion of your work, which is Plato and Aristotle, by pretending to be objective, giving you a place of abstract justice, actually gave you the most partial perspective of them all. But Thucydides, by giving you excess partiality, gets you to some kind of objectivity. That's what I found so ironic and interesting.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting way to put it. I mean, it is certainly true that you would think of Plato and Aristotle as explaining how objective knowledge is possible, and Nietzsche's denying that. And Nietzsche's saying, actually, Thucydides is the much better example because of his willingness to adopt so many different perspectives of both the conquerors and the conquered, and to be honest, without moral prejudice about this is what these people really think about things.
So this has been a fascinating interview, and I will confess, I have come out of it a lot more convinced of this position. And what really did it for me is I didn't realize that reason actually had quite a significant role to play by building these basic affects, the basic emotions, as well as adjusting that. So when you show that there's a significant role for reason to play, this whole view becomes a lot more reasonable.
A lot depends on what is meant by reason here. But if you mean, inculcating, showing people that some of their beliefs are false and some are true, then yes, because Nietzsche does this all the time.
Right. Or maybe I should say rhetoric or something like that.
Yeah.
So let me conclude with one final question. And let's go back to the beginning, your own Marxism. Doesn't it lessen the strength of your rhetoric or the necessity of you wanting to bring about some kind of post-capitalist world when you realize that it's at bottom some kind of preference?
Okay, so let me say one thing. The only people who ever think I'm a Marxist are people who aren't Marxists, because I reject quite a lot of things that Marx believes in. The other thing to say about Marx is I think Marx is primarily a descriptive and explanatory theory. It explains how historical change occurs, it explains how capitalism actually operates, and it has an account of why the way capitalism operates bodes ill for capitalism's long-term future. The descriptive explanatory theory is either true or it's false. Some aspects of it seem reasonably plausible. It's probably too soon to say whether it's true. So I actually don't think it's a matter, Marxism is a matter of a normative point of view. And Marx himself was very uninterested in, Marx's argument was never that capitalists morally ought to stop being capitalists. He would have thought that was an absurd judgment. Because a capitalist can't survive unless they do certain things in a capitalist market. That's the crucial thing. Marx and Milton Friedman agree about quite a lot. It's rather ironic. So I don't actually think I need to answer that, except to go back to the very place we started, which is Marx is more of a moral egalitarian than Nietzsche. And I guess I share Marx's concern about the well-being of the vast majority in a way that Nietzsche doesn't really give a hoot.
And I guess for you, it doesn't dampen your fervor of wanting to spread that ideal, even if it's just your own preference.
The point is, it's not an ideal. I'm not spreading an ideal. It's a descriptive explanatory theory.
No, I'm talking about your egalitarianism. What I'm trying to say is, just because it's not objective doesn't make your joy in spreading it or the urgency of which you feel you want to inculcate this egalitarianism and other any less so. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I take no interest in spreading it. So that's what, I mean, I'm just telling you what
You're talking about like a disease.
One of my bedrock evaluative commitments is. And I think it's none the worse for not being objective. That's correct. But I kind of feel that way about my preference for Japanese food over Thai food. It's none the worse, even though it's not objectively the case that Japanese food is better than Thai food. And a lot of people would be unhappy with that, but I'm perfectly happy with it.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks for a fascinating interview.
Thank you.
Tell us a bit about your journey into philosophy, why Nietzsche's morality, and what compelled you to write these two books.
My journey into philosophy actually started in high school. I took an advanced placement French, as they called it, and we read Sartre's No Exit, and we may have read Existentialism is a Humanism, and we read Camus' The Stranger. So I thought of philosophy as existentialism. I read Nietzsche for the first time on Easter Sunday, 1982. An irony given Nietzsche's relationship to Christianity. It was this early essay of Nietzsche's called On Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense, which he never published, but it's an essay resonant with sort of existential themes, about the insignificance of human beings, in the context of the wider world, and the writing was great. And I was just totally captivated by it, totally captivated. And then I basically took every possible course I could where there was an opportunity to read some Nietzsche, to write about, I took like an English poetry course and I wrote about William Blake and Nietzsche, even though Nietzsche wasn't aside. So as I got more deeply into Nietzsche, of course, there's much more than the sort of existential side of Nietzsche. And of course, the central topic Nietzsche is occupied with is morality and what's wrong with it.
Right.
And as I became more serious, I began to read the secondary literature. And, what I came to think was there wasn't really an adequate or philosophically sophisticated account of the structure of the critique. So I thought, I had actually something to contribute here.
So this is a paragraph from your book that helped me situate your work amongst the other secondary scholars. I quote to you your book. By the end of World War II, Nietzsche's association in popular consciousness with the Nazis made it hard enough to discuss his philosophy in polite academic circles, even without delving into his illiberal and disturbing ethical views. To rescue Nietzsche for scholarly study, it was necessary either to whitewash his ethical views, as Walter Kaufmann did, or to locate Nietzsche's primary philosophical concerns outside of ethics, for example, as a metaphysical philosopher, as in Heidegger's famous, this is your word, misreading, or as a certain sort of philosophical skeptic about truth, knowledge, and meaning, an approach favored by Jacques Derrida. This later approach, which dominated Nietzsche's studies from the 1960s until the 1990s, received its most sophisticated articulation by Alexander Nehamas. Kaufmann, who introduced Nietzsche to the English-speaking world, Heidegger, the last great philosopher, Derrida, the great postmodernist, and Nehamas, who some consider to be a great Nietzsche scholar, all of them have read Nietzsche wrong, not by accident, but necessarily so to preserve Nietzsche. And the import of your two books is that you're going to give us Nietzsche with his fangs intact, so to speak. Is that a good way to understand it?
Well, partly. I would characterize this a little differently. I mean, first of all, understand that Nietzsche was extremely popular before World War II, even in the English-speaking world. H.L. Mencken, the famous journalist, wrote a book on Nietzsche. George Bernard Shaw was a big Nietzsche fan. The association with the Nazis did create a problem, though, for the reception of Nietzsche within the academy. It's worth emphasizing that until the Nazis took over, there were all kinds of Nietzsches, even in Germany. I mean, there was a socialist Nietzsche, there was, believe it or not, a feminist Nietzsche, there were sort of romantic poets who had their version of Nietzsche, and then, of course, there was this sort of proto-nationalist Nietzsche. Because the Nazis took power, they simply enforced that one, and this led to the disaster for his reputation. Walter Kaufmann clearly had as his task to make Nietzsche respectable and safe. And as I say, he was a great translator, and his original book on Nietzsche had some genuine insights, but his Nietzsche comes out sounding like a sort of secular self-help liberal. That's not Nietzsche. You can't really start seriously with Nietzsche without recognizing that he is deeply illiberal in a very precise sense. That is, he does not believe in the moral equality of human beings. Right? And that's the one thing he tends to have in common with a certain position on the political right. Heidegger, who I do not consider a great philosopher, but that's a separate story, I don't think it's controversial. Heidegger was not a scholar when he read anyone. He read every figure in the history of philosophy with an eye to him, right? So he has to read Nietzsche as the last metaphysician, Plato being the first, so that Heidegger can be the first. It sets himself up. He sets himself up as bringing philosophy to its conclusion. Derrida is not really a scholar either. I mean, he talks about various historical figures. The only scholarly book Derrida ever wrote on a historical figure was on Husserl, and it's not a good book if you talk to Husserl scholars. Now, the one who I think was actually a serious scholar of those four you mentioned was Ney Hamas, who began really as a scholar of Plato and Socrates. But he gave us a Nietzsche that I think was a more sophisticated version of the French Nietzsche, right? And more intelligible, more clearly presented with better textual documentation and so on. The very first article I ever published in a peer-refereed journal in 1992 was a critique of Ney Hamas's reading, pointing out that the text didn't really support his central claim, which is that Nietzsche is committed to something called aestheticism, that he views life in the world as like a literary character in literary text. And in fact, you can't sustain that when you look carefully at the text. But that was a much more sophisticated piece of scholarship. I do think the turning point for philosophically serious Nietzsche studies was Mortimer Clark's 1990 book called Nietzsche on Truth and Philosophy. And that I think marked the beginning of a change where people with a lot of knowledge of philosophy generally started to sort of scrutinize Nietzsche for the arguments, for the nuances of the position. And together with that, there was increasing interest in reading Nietzsche in historical context. And I do think that is very important, and one of the things I tried to do in Nietzsche on Morality.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important ideas in history. If you're interested in learning more about Nietzsche, then a great entry point is one of his most important books, The Genealogy of Morality. Its main argument is that everything you've learned to call morality, equality, altruism, compassion, moderation, are actually values designed to suffocate greatness. If you want to learn why Nietzsche thought so, and how he came to hold these values in the first place, then go check out my lecture on the genealogy. You can find links to everything we discussed today in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.